I mean, the answer is like complex systems fail in complex ways. So you might worry that like, well, one AVS gets slashed, but there's a big overlap between the operators in this AVS and another one. And then suddenly that second AVS kind of also ends up with some slashing conditions. And now maybe a third AVS, right? So you can get this kind of contagion from one AVS to another if you set things up wrong. And in that kind of high risk scenario, now suddenly you've got a bunch of operators who are also Ethereum operators who are suddenly being, penalized for their behavior that has nothing to do with Ethereum. And so if that ripples back into Ethereum, now we have to worry that somehow, Ethereum is trying to set up its own set of incentives, but those incentives have nothing to do with the incentives in the AVSs that live on top. And so at least in principle, you could have problems.
Welcome to the Protocol Podcast. I'm Brad Keoun here with my co-hosts Margaux Nijkerk and Sam Kessler. So excited to dive into today's show, the latest news and developments in technology behind crypto and blockchains. First, please do not forget to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Protocol, on CoinDesk.com. And let's get right into it. We did have a lot of good stories today that we were thinking about covering. We had to pick a couple, but one of them was Vitalik Buterin's 30th birthday, and he's already created an entire blockchain ecosystem. How many people do that before age 30? Anyway, all right, let's get into it. Our first story here. Lido DAO rebukes Layer 0 by endorsing rivals Wormhole Axelor for crypto bridge. It's quite a mouthful. Sam, this is your story. A lot of words that I didn't know 5 years ago, but
tell us. A lot of words.
But it's a fascinating story. Tell us, just give us the eighth graders version of this story.
Yeah, a lot of words, a lot of companies here. The story itself, I think it's kind of just entertaining, but it gets to some like core ideas and concepts around DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, which are these, organizing groups on blockchains that kind of govern protocols like Lido, the liquid staking protocol on Ethereum. And they do this governance by tokens. They have tokens that they distribute to members of the, blockchain community that they live on. And those tokens can usually double as votes in some sort of a governance system. So Lido DAO, Lido, which is, again, liquid staking protocol on Ethereum, one of the biggest protocols in crypto generally, I think the biggest DeFi protocol. It needed to find a new bridge to, shuttle tokens from the Ethereum blockchain where the Lido protocol lives and its staked ETH token, which is one of the biggest tokens on Ethereum, lives, to other blockchains. And this thing happened recently where Layer 0, which is the biggest bridge provider in this sort of like competitive turf battle between infrastructure providers that do this bridging, they released a product that allows users to do this thing that I was talking about, moving ETH to a bunch of other blockchains. But they did this apparently without talking first to the Lido DAO, without submitting a proposal, going through this whole due diligence process that the Lido DAO says it's supposed to do. And as a result, Lido DAO got really, really pissed off. And they later had a new election where they kind of like surreptitiously, disgraced, admonished this Layer 0 bridge and said, hey, from now on, we're going to give our formal endorsement to this other bridge for bridging tokens from the Ethereum blockchain to specifically in this case, the Binance BNB chain. So they endorsed in this vote, they being Lido DAO in this vote, two of Layer 0's biggest rivals, those rivals being Wormhole and Axelor. I know that's like a big jumble of things. Again, I hope that cleared it up somewhat, but I'm sure you guys have questions around what we're talking about here and why it's important. But I'll leave it at that for now.
I think this is really interesting because it kind of gets into what, a lot of people on CoinDesk covers is decentralized theater, right? Like you have the mechanisms to set up a DAO, and yet, for one, I guess, who are the people who are making decisions to override the DAO? And two, what's the point of having a DAO then if these kind of decisions can't be made in a decentralized way, right? Like where does this go?
Yeah, I mean, That's like the core thing about this, which is like layer 0. Ethereum is a permissionless protocol. Anybody can build on top of it. And layer 0 created a bridge. One of the beautiful things about this system is that they're able to kind of create this thing where they lock up staked ETH in a smart contract on Ethereum and then reissue it on other blockchains in a wrapped form. That's how a bridge works. They're able to do that without permission from anybody, but they didn't ask for permission, and now they're getting in trouble for it. So layer 0 will probably say, hey, that's screwed up. Like, the whole point of blockchains is that I'm, open source, permissionlessness. I'm able to do something like this, and I don't have to go to anybody for permission. And they do point to specific instances on the Lido DAO where some of their competitors, specifically Axelor, did something like this, where they launched a bridge without like submitting a formal proposal that got voted on by the community, like the community apparently wanted in the layer 0 case. Axelor went and did this in the past for the Cosmos ecosystem. So they're currently issuing tokens from Ethereum to Cosmos. And it sounds like behind the scenes, got some sign off in some offline process from some Lido DAO committee to do the same sort of thing that layer 0 was doing. And nobody was pissed in that case. So it's very confusing, like what the rules are. So it's immature. It's, there's a lot to talk about. I'll stop for a second, but Brad, you look like you're about to say something.
Well, I was just going to say, what does this say about the state of competition among all these bridge projects, right? I mean, it's pretty intense.
Yeah, I mean, one way to look at this is, even though you see Lido DAO throwing its weight, its name and credibility, reputation behind two of these other bridge providers, which is kind of like a tacit endorsement of their technical their security, because bridges are the main things that typically get hacked. And so they're saying, hey, two of layer 0's competitors are better in this case. They're more decentralized also, better for creating a plug and play solution that doesn't lock people into certain kinds of bridges. Anyway, they say that these competitors are better. But it also underscores the fact that layer 0 has, I don't have specific numbers, but they have enough of the bridge market share. They are the market leader. They have enough of that market now that two of its biggest rivals, that are between themselves rivals, are willing to team up with one another to create a proposal to bridge tokens that don't lock people into specific ecosystems. So yeah, this is almost a sign that layer 0 might be on its way to winning this really competitive race, at least as it stands right now and as it's been defined right now.
Yeah. I mean, especially with Lido, becoming such a huge force too. But, and we've talked about, since last year, about just how many blockchains there are all of a sudden, and more all the time, and these bridges are going to play such a key role in connecting it all, right?
And what does an endorsement mean in this world too? Because you've got a bunch of protocols that live on top of all these ecosystems that are now throwing endorsements behind different infrastructure that anybody can use, whether it's endorsed or not. So I think that these also proves as a test case, like, hey, open source, again, permissionless. You can use anything. You can build anything. What does it mean for certain things that do the same thing as other things to have an endorsement from a credible project? Like, does that actually, like, are we, specifically in this case, going to see more traffic flowing through the infrastructure that Lido DAO has endorsed? Does that matter?
They've all got their BFFs.
Yeah. And is that good? I mean, what's decentralization if it's all buddy behind the scenes?
That's a cool story, and thanks for explaining it to us, Sam. All right, Margaux, the next story coming your way is your story. As blockchains push toward decentralization, these people serve as ultimate guardians. This story started off as the Polygon Protocol Council story that you were doing, Margaux, and it's such a cool one. Why don't you tell us about it?
Well, this all started because, as many know, Polygon is on its roadmap to redefine the blockchain and its ecosystem. And as part of that, they have decided to create a Polygon Protocol Council. So I was like, what is a protocol council? So I just started to ask questions like, is there a need for this? Like, what is the purpose behind this? Like some skepticism. And I think as the reporting went on, my ultimate conclusion was like, okay, I understand why there's a council like this that's created. So what is this council, right? Basically, it's made up of, this specific council is made up of 13 members that are there to maintain the security of the protocol. There are two instances where they sort of come into play. The first one is through the like normal governance process, where there's some kind of protocol change that needs to be made to the network, and they're involved in that governance framework. And they sign off on implementing those changes after it's approved by the community, and goes through various stages. But also in the event that there is a major, a hack or something that needs immediate attention, this council can be called on to implement those changes and override this governance framework. They framed it as sort of a way of a step in the right direction towards full decentralization, because the ultimate goal is for the blockchain to run itself, for the protocol just to control its own code, while the other end of the spectrum is having some other protocols that some of the members on the protocol council have told me. So there's some other protocols that have foundations that like purely run the security and maintain the security of the blockchain. And this is sort of this intermediary where there are people involved in this who are involved sort of with Polygon, but not necessarily working for Polygon, who have an interest in the roadmap of Polygon, to implement these security changes to follow the kind of governance for this, but also be there in the event that something happens, because ultimately, layer twos and these rollups, they're fairly new networks. So they don't have the ability to control themselves right now. It's too nascent. There's too much of a risk to have some kind of bug. And that's why there's this, as one person I interviewed said, there's this lesser evil step that they need to take, which is creating these councils so that there can be that kind of backup in the event something big to the protocol happens in terms of its security.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something interesting in your piece, around like just broadly the inconsistency that you have between these different implementations of a protocol council, of a security council. So obviously, like you just said, like this is a weird sort of a system where you have these, decentralized code-based systems that are governed by human beings at key parts of the chain. So it's like, it doesn't matter if the rest of it is decentralized. Ultimately, if these 12 or however many people in some cases control a multi-sig address that, has control over the funds that bridge things from one project to another, like, maybe to get a little bit more specific, one specific thing that I thought was crazy about your piece, I want to write more about soon with one of our colleagues, Danny Nelson, is like optimism. Their protocol council, they have this setup where it's anonymous, and a lot of protocols do this with regards to who actually has the key controlling the multi-sig for the optimism bridge. So this is one of the biggest protocols in crypto. There's random people that they're not random, but we don't know who they are, who control things.
Yeah.
They say that's for security, but not only are we trusting humans, but we're trusting humans who we don't know who they are.
There's definitely an inconsistency with that, I think. And I briefly mentioned that in the piece, and this is something definitely that you should get more dig a hole into, because when I was writing this, I was trying to figure out who from the optimism side, and they call it a security council. Arbitrum also has one. They these names are sort of all over the place, but they all basically do the same thing: protocol and security council. So the optimism one, yes, they say we don't share how many people are on this security council, and we also don't share their identities because in the to protect the security of the network. Polygon, on the other hand, is saying something differently. They're saying, look, we are all public figures, you know who we are, and there's 13 of them. Someone I spoke to is the creator of ECC in Paris, right? So that's a pretty public figure. The other one is someone that does a lot of the security audits for Polygon and also some of these layer twos to have, and they said specifically that they chose to release their identities because they want to give credibilities, and that in the event that something happens, they can hold them accountable, or that the ecosystem can sort of trust these people. So it is interesting to see sort of like who these people are. Another thing that is needs to be explored a little bit is that sometimes on some of these councils, there are multiple of the same people. Like Justin Drake is on from the Ethereum Foundation, is on the Polygon one, and I believe he's on another one, and I believe it's Arbitrum, but I could be wrong.
It's the Arbitrum one, if I remember. Yeah.
Right. And so, you would hope that Justin Drake is, and I haven't spoken to Justin Drake about this, but in theory, you would hope that he's smart enough to have different keys or put them in different places. Yeah. But, maybe someone makes a human error and mistake and they get hacked or their keys lost.
There's always bugs. There's
There's
always
always
bugs. Do you
bugs.
remember Danny had that story, one of our colleagues last week, where there was a DAO. I mean, this is a little bit of a side, sidetrack from what we're talking about currently, but like there was a DAO that held a bunch of treasury funds in a multi-sig that was configured in such a manner, or didn't have a flip switched in such a manner that allowed for only one of 12 of the multi-sig signers. Usually you need a majority. That's the point of a multi-sig. But only one of 12 people could sign off and move all the funds. So one of those 12 was like, I can just take this money. And they did.
My God.
One of 12
my God.
multi-sig. It's pretty hilarious.
What's
but
the point of a multi-sig then? Yeah.
None.
Yeah.
There's literally no point, but it is funny.
Yeah,
It's sad.
trust
Drew overlaws it.
everybody.
Trust
but-
everybody.
Well, Margaux, that was such a cool story. I mean, it's like I feel like some of these, the layer twos, they kind of move in herds sometimes. They're all they did the blockchain in the box all at the same time, and now they're doing these security councils. But to your point, there's always some differences in how they do it, right?
Yeah, it really also depends on I think they all have like a subculture, these layer twos. And so they sort of stick to that as well. I don't see any of Optimism maxis going after Optimism for their anonymous security council. And Polygon maxis are probably happy with what's going on with the Polygon security council. So,
Right.
or protocol council. I'm getting them mixed up too, but you get the gist. So,
I mean, at least things
yeah.
are defined, right? They weren't a couple of years ago that you started seeing these things. You actually, at least for the first time, I mean, it gave people a thing to scrutinize because they actually define their security practices. But oftentimes what happened was the security until again, a couple of years ago would be held, like in the case of Arbitrum, in the Arbitrum Foundation, it would just be them, or Off-Chain Labs rather, the developing firm that created this infrastructure. Giving an example, I don't actually know if that's how it worked in that specific case, but anyway, at least you see that they're doing things in such a manner as to try to decentralize things further.
Yeah, totally.
All right. Well, that is a fascinating discussion. Let's wrap it up there. When we come back, we've got Riad Wahby, co-founder and CEO of Cubist. He's also on the faculty at Carnegie Mellon. And I spoke with him a couple months ago, and it was a great discussion. So we've got him coming up and talking about some of these same issues, actually, in terms of various security aspects. We'll be right back. Calling all developers. Score a Consensus 2024 Developer Pass for just $109, but act fast. Only a limited number of these passes are available. You may have heard that Consensus ain't for devs, but here's why you're wrong. Consensus is the only place you can fully immerse yourself in a multi-chain environment and learn directly from 20-plus chains, including Arbitrum, Chainlink, Solana, and more. Enjoy 3 days of intensive learning with technical talks, 40-plus expert speakers, and 20-plus in-depth workshops, including dedicated half-days for Ethereum and Bitcoin, and 3 full days of programming on our Protocol Village stage. Consensus 2024 is happening May 29th through 31st in Austin, Texas. Don't miss your chance to network at curated developer meetups, find new career opportunities, and explore hundreds of side events and hacker houses around town. Grab your $109 developer pass today, but remember, this exclusive offer is limited. Visit consensus.coindesk.com now to secure your developer pass before they're gone. Explore the epicenter of blockchain innovation at Consensus 2024. Okay, we're back here with Riad Wahby, co-founder and CEO of Cubist. Cubist is a developer of hardware-backed, non-custodial key storage and signing infrastructure that enables companies to protect staking keys and secure withdrawals. It's quite a mouthful, as a lot of these things are, Riad. But Riad is also, by the way, great at explaining things because he is a professor. In this case, he is on the electrical and computer engineering faculty at Carnegie Mellon University, and he's been around in academia a lot, but is also an entrepreneur here. Riyadh, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to the chat.
Yeah. Well, we're looking forward too. All right. I was thinking about how we could get into this, Riyadh, and I thought it might be good if, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, like make it quick, but try to orient people in terms of kind of like top of the, crypto taxonomy, blockchain, and then homing in on exactly the problem that y'all are focusing on.
Yeah. So, in some sense, maybe this is one way to think about it. Let's say
Yeah.
is actually, like, keys are kind of everything, right? Like, every time you interact with a blockchain, what are you doing? Well, you interact with a node, et cetera. But if you want to actually have an effect on the world, you have to generate a signature and post it, right? Like, that's kind of the fundamentals, right? And so, in some sense, like that's your interface to the whole world. And so there's a lot of leverage there, but there's also, of course, a lot of danger. And we've seen, I think in the prior segment, there was a big discussion about like, well, how do you manage the keys? And so I think our perspective on this is that there are a lot of things that individuals and companies can do to improve their security posture just by thinking about, like, what is it that my keys should do, what should they be able to do, what shouldn't they be able to do. And so being able to in some sense say, look, this key has certain things that it can do, and then everything else will just be ruled out by, say, the hardware, or by some system that lives around the key that kind of just protects it and makes sure that it can only be used for the right things. So you can think about doing a lot of different things with that. If it's your wallet, you could say, look, I know that today I'm only going to be trading, with a couple, let's say I'm going to hit a couple dexes. No other transactions should be allowed. Okay, zooming out, if I'm doing some kind of trading strategy, well, I can sort of build a model for, like, what are the trades going to look like, what are those transactions going to look like, and then my key can actually enforce, like, you're actually making a transaction that is consistent with what you said your trading strategy was. And then you mentioned validators. This is a big area where we've been putting a lot of thought, and there, I think for a lot of folks in the Ethereum ecosystem, for example, basically, if you're running a validator, the thing that you're most worried about is, am I going to get slashed, right? Because that's kind of the disaster scenario. In some sense, getting slashed is just a matter of, like, signing the wrong message. I mean, forget it, in some sense, that is it. Like, if you sign the wrong message, you get slashed. If you don't sign the wrong message, you don't get slashed. So if you can somehow say, well, look, this key knows this message is bad and this message is good, and it'll only sign the good one. I mean, maybe that sounds silly. Maybe it sounds like too reductive, but in fact, you can do that. Like, the slashing condition for Ethereum is actually pretty simple, and it's something that your key, in some vague sense, can enforce on its own. And so that's the system that we've built. We've built a system where you can actually just build the policies into the key. And so for folks who are doing things like validation, what that means is they can just have confidence that even if everything else goes off the rails, even if they mess up their infrastructure, even if their client has a bug in it, which is something that we've seen in the Ethereum ecosystem, and I think we're going to continue to see, especially with restaking coming on, even if all of those kind of disaster scenarios happen, as long as your key is sort of making the right decisions about whether it should or shouldn't sign something, you're safe. And so this is fundamentally the kind of approach that we're taking.
And just again, to help to ground us, tell us exactly, like, who is your customer, generally speaking? Is there a particular ecosystem you're focused on, and what do you do for those customers?
When we're talking about validation, our focus has up till now been primarily in the Ethereum ecosystem, and sort of by extension in the kind of restaking ecosystem growing up around it. So, we announced last year a partnership with Eigenlayer. We've been really kind of thinking hard about how to secure AVSs, how to make operators confident in that, as they enter that ecosystem. We're also working with the folks at Babylon. So that's sort of an interesting twist on restaking, staking Bitcoin through a really cool piece of technology. So we're working closely with them. We've announced a partnership there too. So on the validation side, that's our primary focus.
So you've mentioned this restaking thing a few times, maybe to ground our listeners. You said Eigenlayer specifically. This is one of these protocols that's popped up, the main one, that comes to mind over the past couple of years, that lets people take the Ethereum in the case of Eigenlayer that they've staked, or the Ether rather, that they've staked on the Ethereum network, and use it to not only help now secure Ethereum, but to secure other networks, other protocols. There's a lot of risks with that, which is kind of what you're nodding to with this whole idea of, key security when it comes to restaking. Can you speak a little bit about, first off, what those risks are? Why are people kind of concerned about this? Vitalik Buterin being one, the idea that Ethereum itself should just be kind of like one network doing one, sort of thing security wise. Anyway, I'll let you talk a little bit about what those risks are.
Yeah, there are a bunch of different risks, and it depends on which perspective you're taking, which risks you're thinking about. So Vitalik's take on this, I mean, he's got a very nuanced take on this, and obviously knows a ton about what's going on. But his take is essentially like, how do we protect the Ethereum ecosystem from other ugly stuff that could happen, right? And what kind of ugly stuff could happen? Well, if there's some kind of event where a bunch of people have restaked, then that you could imagine some kind of, and I mean, very hypothetically, some kind of contagion type event where one bad event in the restaking ecosystem sort of ramifies in the Ethereum staking layer, right? A bunch of people get slashed for stuff that doesn't really have to do with Ethereum; it has to do with the restaking. So that's I mean, that's obviously something
So it's
to
like
worry about.
leverage almost, right? It's like you're
Yeah,
levering up
exactly.
your exposure or the exposure of the Ethereum protocol.
Exactly right. So if I'm an operator, that's basically what I'm doing. When I'm operating as a restaking operator, I stake my Ethereum, and then I say, well, look, since I've staked the Ethereum, I also want to, participate in this other network that basically gets its security from the fact that I've staked Ethereum. And so now if I mess up in the sort of secondary network, that can have ramifications for my stake in Ethereum, right? So there's an interesting thing here, and this is like now on the technical risk side. So these Eigenlayer defines these entities called AVSs. These are
Mhm.
autonomously validated services, and the idea there is each of these AVSs is or actively validated. Sorry, I made a mistake there. Each of these services is essentially developing their own consensus protocol, where the stake that they're using to sort of have people participate in the proof of stake is at least partially derived from Ethereum stake. So there's sort of this derivative of Ethereum stake, and that is what gives you the ability to validate in these services. So those AVSs can define their own slashing conditions, right? So in Ethereum, if you double sign or if you do a surround sign, there are these kind of technical conditions for what constitutes slashing. And Ethereum has, designed their system so that you get slashed if you do things that are really bad for the Ethereum consensus. AVSs can do the same thing. They can say, here's the set of conditions under which you would get slashed, and some of those are completely isomorphic to the ones in Ethereum. Like, if you're running a consensus protocol, you might say double signing, you get slashed. But you can dream up basically anything you want, right? So you can come up with some crazy condition, like, well, if 50% of the validators go offline, all the validators get slashed, which seems nuts, but like, somebody might opt into that if it paid them enough. They might say, well, we're going to take the risk, right? But so the worry, and I'm not saying that this is always going to happen or that this is likely to happen, but the worry is that somehow you get a bunch of these AVSs that all have these kind of weird slashing conditions. It becomes really hard to reason about what happens in some bad event, and then suddenly the bad event occurs, and now I think the concern, again, I'm not saying that this is likely, is that somehow that affects the underlying security, the security of Ethereum.
What is the somehow? I think that's like the missing piece for a lot of us.
So I mean, the answer is like complex systems fail in complex ways. So you might worry that like, well, one AVS gets slashed, but there's a big overlap between the operators in this AVS and another one, and then suddenly that second AVS kind of also ends up with some slashing conditions, and now maybe a third AVS, and right. So you can get this kind of contagion from one AVS to another if you set things up wrong. And in that kind of high risk scenario, now suddenly you've got a bunch of operators who are also Ethereum operators who are suddenly being penalized for their behavior that has nothing to do with Ethereum. And so if that ripples back into Ethereum, now we have to worry that somehow Ethereum is trying to set up its own set of incentives, but those incentives have nothing to do with the incentives in the AVSs that live on top. And so at least in principle, you could have problems.
It's almost like analogous to like the whole Terra thing that we saw a couple of years ago, where in a completely different way, you had this like system somewhere that had all these weird conditions that were, inflating the value or whatever of this asset that was then being used to secure and run and power a bunch of other things somewhere else. It ended up crashing everything all the way to institutions, to FTX, and everything that relied on it. So, it's just one more of those things that we see so much in finance and in particular in crypto.
Yeah, I mean, we're sitting here and we're talking a lot about the risks that are associated with restaking and all the innovations and protocols that are coming out of restaking on Eigenlayer or setting up an AVS. I'm wondering, like, in your view, this whole restaking ecosystem that's emerging, is this something that is viable, or is this something that is like not a trend, but just like a hot thing that's happened?
Like yield
I want to
farming,
use it. Yeah, like
like
is
another
this
thing that
just a
returns.
it's just like why does restaking need to like be a thing, or why is restaking needed for blockchains, if it is at all?
Yeah, I think first of all, it absolutely is viable. Like we've been talking about risks because I mean, it's important to assess them,
Sure.
but I think there's absolutely huge upsides. So one huge upside of the restaking ecosystem is that it provides you kind of a base layer on which to build new technology where you're not reinventing the wheel. So, the restaking ecosystem gives you kind of the fundamentals of, if I want to have a proof of stake chain, I need to find people who are going to opt in. I need to have them run a validator. I need to make sure that all of that kind of stuff works. And so all of that infrastructure is basically there for you. And now you can focus on the thing that you're doing that's bringing the sort of the new piece, the new interesting stuff to the ecosystem. So I think what we're going to see is that this unlocks a lot of innovation. It's going to, we're going to see people who are coming up with kind of all like very interesting kind of crazy things where they've been able to focus just on the new piece, just on the thing that they're bringing to the table, and not on kind of reinventing the wheel. So I think that's the reason to be super optimistic about this.
Mm-hmm.
The question, in terms of the design principle of designing things, A, for failure, or B, assuming that there's malicious actors out there, right? And if there is a way that people can do bad things, they will, but I mean, here we're talking about using, as a validator, using these anti-slashing, uh, mechanisms to avoid getting slashed. But, some people might not take those precautions or use those systems, right? And so how do you build a system that can withstand those people who don't do it?
Yeah, great question. So I think so first of all, I think the standard answer to, how do we withstand people who are just gonna, whatever it might be. Maybe it's not that they're malicious necessarily, but that they're trying to run at the absolute lowest cost. They're trying to cut every corner, just trying to, make yield without putting, much
Right.
thought into it. I think first of all, that's the biggest risk, right? Like the incentives are make the money, kind of YOLO. And I mean, really, right? So, I mean, I think honestly, the answer is that on top of all of this, like on top of this formal system of machines interacting in a way that's specified by a protocol, we're going to have informal systems of information, and maybe more formal ones eventually too. But basically, what you're going to see is something similar to today. When somebody says, "I want to invest in a liquid staking protocol," I mean, the very first thing that people say is, "Well, here are the three that you should think about because they're the ones that have the best reputation. They're the obvious ones." We're going to have a similar reputation system for the broader restaking ecosystem. So, if I'm going to put money into an operator, I'm going to presumably choose an operator that gives me the right balance of risk and reward. Right? Obviously, there are going to be some people who are super conservative, only going into the very lowest risk things, and presumably, those operators will see a lot of traffic. But there are other operators who will be very clear. We're going to go into riskier AVSs. We're going to give you more yield as a result. That's great. That's the kind of risk you want to take. The kind of risk you don't want to take is the operator doesn't care, messes up, does things badly, and that's why I lose money, right? Like you're not getting paid I mean, the operator's getting paid more to cut corners, but probably you're not getting more yield because you went with an operator who cut corners, or at least not much more. So making sure that people can make this informed decision, like this operator is doing the right thing, they're taking the right approach to their infrastructure, they're actually trying to prevent slashing and mistakes and all this kind of thing. That's going to be important for people who are actually putting their money in. And so I think what we're going to see is this information ecosystem. We're already seeing folks talking about restaking risk, how we can categorize these things, how we can build insurance products and other kind of derivative products on based on the risk from the operators. And so I think a lot of that kind of thing, as that grows up in the ecosystem, will kind of drive money towards quality.
Now, if I can ask a completely different kind of question, you're, on the faculty at a very esteemed university, particularly when it comes to the discipline of computer science and computer engineering, which is, where you work. I wonder, just, from your perch there, have you noticed engineering students, computer scientists, programmers still moving to blockchain tech and still working at blockchain crypto companies? Have you seen them move instead towards AI? What's the trend looked like over the past few years?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, absolutely the answer is tons of students are still extremely interested in this. But that's true of AI too, right? And to be clear, like CMU has a fantastic AI department and like literally an entire department. And so like the answer is I think we see kind of a huge push towards both. I think okay. So my PhD advisor was Dan Bonet at Stanford, and he taught one of the first like classes on sort of blockchain
Very famous in the
technology.
crypto world.
Yeah, I mean Dan's fantastic. I love Dan. And so I used to ask him about this, like, hey, how does the enrollment for this class go? He says, well, it kind of tracks a little bit the price of Bitcoin. As Bitcoin goes up, more people enroll in the class, like year to year.
Yeah.
And I mean that's hilarious, but I think obviously it's true, right? Like there's more like that's a measure of opportunity. Unfortunately, it's a trailing measure, right? So like the people who went in 2021 and then graduated in 2022, like maybe saw a little shock. But but like on a serious note, I'd say like there's a ton of interest in computer security, cryptography, all of the kind of elements that go into building in blockchains. And then on top of that, there are a lot of students who are super like undergrads who are like super advanced at writing smart contracts, building DeFi protocols. I mean, it's kind of amazing. So yeah, I'd say super strong interest. And what we're starting to see now is a convergence. People talking about, how can I use ML and blockchain together? Whether it's ZKML or whether it's this kind of thing. So I think that's an exciting future where we have people who are kind of crossing the streams and really kind of putting together some interesting stuff we haven't imagined yet.
And just, I think we got to probably wrap it up here, Riad, and this has been fascinating, but, how do you, we've talked about this and we've talked about doing the story. We haven't done it, but how do you, as this, entrepreneur in this crazy world, that we're covering and that you're working in, and it's, so fast moving and so much information and there's so much to do. How do you juggle that running this company with being a professor? Like, is there a secret there? Like, you're not really teaching that much, or like, how do you make it work, or how does that work, generally speaking?
Okay, so I am actually teaching an undergraduate course this semester. In prior semesters,
What's the
haven't.
course? I'm just curious.
Computer security.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah,
which is a fantastic course. It's super fun. I think the students really love it. But okay, honestly, the answer is a little less sleep, a little bit of working smarter, not harder. I mean, trying to be as productive as possible. And I think this is something that there's a lot of synergy here. So like a lot of the time when I'm thinking about a research question, I can also kind of in the back of my head, there's something that's very closely related, maybe on the technical side in the company. And so there's a lot of times when I can kind of get a little more bang for the buck just by kind of thinking a little smarter. So, but that said, like at the bottom, more work. I think the only thing you can do is sleep a little less, drink a little more coffee.
I feel like there's one key thing that you maybe forgot to mention, which is grad students. Like they must play a role in some way, I would guess, right?
Teaching assistants.
Yeah. So shouts out to the TAs. Our head TA in particular this semester she's fantastic. My grad students are amazing. They're extremely productive, and they're just like totally like they're doing such a great job. I'm sure that they wish that they like had a little more of my time, and I'm sorry to them. But they are like really honestly doing fantastic work, and I mean that's honestly that is kind of the major benefit of being at a place like CMU. The grad students and the undergrads are kind of unparalleled. So I mean I count myself lucky that we have such great students.
Amazing. Riad, thank you so much. I mean, fascinating discussion. We'd love to have you back at some point.
Thanks for having me. This has been super fun.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks.
Well, that is a wrap for this week's The Protocol podcast. Thank you, Riad, for joining us. Thank you for listening to The Protocol podcast. If you have any questions about any stories or comments, please do not hesitate to reach out to us at podcasts@coindesk.com, subject line The Protocol. You can listen to us weekly on CoinDesk Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Protocol, on CoinDesk.com, where we did actually have, I think, Riad, your story about the story I read about Cubist was featured in the Protocol newsletter a couple months ago. But anyway, all right. See you next week. Thanks a lot.